Welcome to the April 9th, 2025 episode of the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today's working title is Smith, Manning Hold Big Oil's Gun to Canada's Head. Now, yesterday, Andrew Coyne, who's a Globe and Mail columnist, wrote a piece called If You're Going to Threaten to Secede, You Might at Least Have the Numbers to Back It Up. And what he was doing was responding to an op-ed that Preston Manning, the former leader of the Reform Party and the head of the Canada Strong and Free Network, and I'm sorry that that name still makes me giggle a little bit when I say it. But anyway, Preston wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail himself on April 3rd. It was titled, Mark Carney Poses a Threat to National Unity. And the essence of Coyne's argument, why he takes issue with Manning, is the fact that there isn't popular support for secession, for independence, for Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so Angus Reid had a poll come out a couple of days ago, and they asked the question of people from across Canada, how do you support your province leaving the country? So let's have a look at it. Now, if you take a look at this, 15% of Canadians, if the Liberals aren't in power, want their province to leave. 20% if the Liberals are in. And I think personally, I think a lot of that is just a lingering dislike of the Liberals that were in power for 10 years under Justin Trudeau, who left in January. He stepped down. Mark Carney ran for the Liberal leadership. He won. Therefore, he becomes prime minister. He called the election. We're now 2 weeks in to an election campaign. Okay, so let's look at by the provinces. The only provinces, as you can see, that are interested in independence are Alberta and Saskatchewan. And even without a Liberal government, 25 and 20%. I don't think there's not a lot of interest. I've lived in Saskatchewan for 25 years, lived in Alberta for 10 of them, and I've been back many, many times. And I can tell you that the core of the independence movement in those provinces is very, very small. And they're not run by the best organized folks either. They tend to come from if you are American friends, this may not mean much to you, but the convoy crowd from 2022 that occupied Canada. They were basically, took a bunch of semi-trucks and parked them outside the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. That's the crowd that supports independence. But as you can plainly see from the data here, that's not the case for the rest of the country. That's the point that Coyne was making about Preston Manning's op-ed. Coyne also brought up comments that have been made by Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta. Now, on March 20th, I got this information from a tweet, but I think she also put out a press release that I've seen as well. And what she said was, if the Liberals win, Mark Carney must agree to 9 conditions within 6 months, or there would be a unprecedented national unity crisis. So echoing Manning, and we're talking about independence. The problem here is that every one of those 9 conditions has to do with oil and gas. Build pipelines, east, west, north, repeal the changes that were made, fairly mild changes, to be honest, to the Environmental Assessment Act, the federal one, on and on and on. And Manning doesn't mention oil issues specifically. He's mentioned the pipelines and so on, but mainly it's, we're angry, and we're going to take our ball and go home if the Liberals get elected again, which is a very, very odd argument. But on 2 days ago, on April 7th, I did a show called Canada Election 2025, Pierre Poilievre and the Masters of His Universe. And I want to bring this in because there I laid out the argument for why Poilievre is the type of personality he is. Because I've seen hundreds of him, guys just like him, people just like him in Calgary. And what's behind the alienation, that big chip on their shoulder, and this is what I argue in the piece from 2 days ago, is the oil industry's frustrations. For decades now, it has been trying to build more pipelines and be a bigger player. And you need to know that Canada is number 4 in global oil production, number 5 in global gas production. But of the three, there's 4 countries at the top. So the United States is 13.2 million barrels per day, and then so Russia and Saudi Arabia have about 9.2, and Canada comes in at 5, and that's basically Alberta, because Alberta companies control most of the production in other provinces, as well as Alberta, which makes up 80% of the 5 million. So here's my point. They're sitting on 170 billion barrels of bitumen. That's recoverable barrels. The actual resource is much bigger than that. And they believe that they could produce just as much as Saudi Arabia and Russia. And because of the 4 countries, only Alberta is landlocked. United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia can all get their oil with a pipeline to a coast and then ship it off in a tanker, which is really cheap. And Alberta can't do that. Alberta has to go through other provincial jurisdictions, whether it's west to the west coast stands British Columbia, which is kind of more left-leaning, more environmental than Alberta. And then otherwise it has to go through all the rest of the Canadian provinces if it wants to go to the east coast. It hasn't had very good luck. It's had pipeline projects denied or canceled, and that's the long history behind that. But the point here is frustrated ambition. The people in the oil industry, the CEOs on down, all think of themselves as masters of the universe. And if the federal government would just get out of the way, Alberta could be Saudi Arabia, it could be Russia, it could play with those countries in terms of wealth, in terms of power, in terms of oil output. So what you've got here, folks, is frustrated ambition. And I argued that Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, came out of that culture. And there's so many others that you can point to who have been part of the Canadian political culture who share that kind of chippy attitude. Prime Minister Stephen Harper and former Premier Jason Kenney and any number of their cabinet members and on and on. I mean, you could put together a whole list for you. It'd be a long list. So now I want to talk just for a moment about what their current ambition is, because Heather Exner-Poirot, who is the Director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, sort of a right-leaning think tank, and she's been on my podcast, and we debated about a number of oil and gas issues. And she's pretty bright, and she comes armed with data. This is what she tweeted today, or jeeted, whatever your preference is. Quote, "The barrel is competitive, but the business environment is not competitive. My kingdom for energy policies that leverage our world-class resources instead of stymie them." There, in those 2 sentences, are laid bare Alberta's ambition. If you would only get out of our way, oh, what we could do on the global stage. But no, you continue to frustrate us. You frustrated us for decades. And now we're so angry and we're so frustrated that we're going to threaten a national unity crisis if the government is reelected. And instead of Pierre Poilievre, who has promised us everything we want. If there's a conservative government, Poilievre said, pipelines, how many pipelines do you want? And how many LNG plants do you want? And what else do you want? We'll repeal all the troublesome legislation. He said that, not in those words, but that's the message. So that's the fundamental tension here in this argument. Coyne doesn't go that far. Coyne stops at talking about or writing about the things that are behind that frustration, behind the threats to national unity crisis. Why would you do it? Like, doesn't anybody ever ask, why does Smith always threaten a national unity crisis? Because it's not the first time she's done it. Why is Preston Manning applying this pressure now? It's because of the frustrated ambitions. And they think that there's an opportunity here they've never had before. And let me explain where that comes from. Okay, so the counter argument to Smith and Manning in the oil industry is that things are going to change in the not too distant future. We here at Energy Media, we have a theory of change. and explains how clean energy technologies have got up on the S curve. So I'll put up the graphic here, and then you can follow along. Okay, so an S curve is basically explains the uh, adoption or diffusion of a new technology into an economy, and this is for oil tech or energy technologies, but it could be iPhones, it could be televisions, whatever technology we're talking about. They all follow this basic pattern, some version of it. So in the 1970s, way down at the far left of the S curve, that's where they start. And then they work their way up the curve till they get to the point where there's an inflection, and that means that they're now competitive with the old technology. So 1970s, solar panels, wind turbines in the 80s, lithium-ion battery, and first commercial EV prototypes in the 90s. And heat pumps are a different animal because they've been around for a long time. But nevertheless, they're kind of in there as well. So around 2020, all of those technologies, solar, wind, EVs, and batteries, hit their inflection point. And what was 2020 is the start of the pandemic, which sort of changed the demand for these technologies and really gave them a boost. So we're going to talk about electric transportation, electric vehicles, because that's the thing that affects global oil demand. Bear with me here. I'll explain this in a moment. So in the 2020, now first thing that happens is it disrupts the global auto industry. And so I don't think there's anybody can argue that the rise of China's auto industry and its EV manufacturing industry has absolutely and utterly disrupted the auto industry. Michael Dunn, who has been on my show a number of times, and he used to be a GM executive, and he was in Indonesia or Malaysia, now consultant with China. And he says up until 2020, the legacy auto executives in China they've been hearing for years and years that the Chinese auto industry was going to catch up and make big strides, and it never happened, and they just stopped believing it. And then all of a sudden it happened, and they were caught unawares. And it's hard to believe that that would be the case, but Michael has said, you can go back to some of those previous interviews and see it. He says, look, they're being shoved out of China. They're losing market share like crazy. They don't really know what to do about it. So it's fair to say that at the global level, the industry has been disrupted. Well, then the next thing is individual business models at the global level become disrupted. So you see, like Nissan, I own an Infiniti, and Nissan may not be around next year. They're running out of cash, and Stellantis has got problems, and some of the German companies have got problems, and a lot of them are having trouble adapting to the transition to electric vehicles. So they're facing competitive pressure from China. And they're facing competitive pressure from electric vehicles, which are threatening to take market share. So now we've seen a thoroughly disrupted auto industry. Now we come to the mid 2020s. What is upstream of the auto industry? It's the oil industry. Because up until 2019, basically 100% of cars ran on oil and gas that was produced from oil. So the fewer combustion engine cars you have, the less demand you have for oil. And so that's what we're seeing. And there's a chart, and you can go and I didn't make a copy of it, but you can check it out on Our World in Data. And it's the percentage of combustion engine cars sold versus electric vehicles. And you see about 2019, it was 96% combustion engines. And then last year it was, I think it was about 75% combustion engines. And this year it's forecast to be about 70%. That's how much market share combustion engine vehicles are losing in the global market. So, once you've got that disrupted, the auto industry disrupted, you're beginning to see the demand. Oh, and I should mention that 45% of oil demand comes from road transport. That's why combustion engine versus electric is important. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Okay, so now what we've got is a disrupted auto industry, and we're beginning to see disruption in the global oil industry. What does that look like, you ask? Well, I've seen a couple of articles pop up in the last month or two, and these are just the beginning. There's other signs as well, but we'll focus on this, that say big oil, so Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron, those kind of companies, are getting out of higher cost oil fields and they're flooding into those fields that are lower cost and lower emissions intensity. And that would be primarily the Permian Basin in West Texas, where I worked for a couple of years, and also the offshore fields in Guyana in Africa. Why are they doing that? Because they see peak oil demand coming. They see decline coming. And so what they're doing is they're looking for oil whose break-even cost is $30. Because above that, if oil is trading in the 40 to 50 range, they can make good enough profits high enough to satisfy their investors. And they think that low prices are coming. Now, Donald Trump and his tariff war have cratered oil prices, over the last 3, 4 days, week, whatever. I wouldn't say we're into structural decline yet, because that's what the majors are looking ahead to, is where the market begins to decline and it declines permanently. There's no going back. This isn't a cyclical decline. It's not clear yet from that what's going on today is cyclical, policy induced, but I don't think it's structural. It's too early for that yet. We haven't seen enough disruption in oil demand caused by the decline in from transportation caused by EVs. That's coming, but I don't think it's here yet. We're still a number of years away. But the International Energy Agency has forecast peak oil demand by 2030. So we're not far, may not be there yet, but we're not far away. And so what happens after 2030 if you've got peak oil demand and then we begin to see a decline sometime in the early to mid 30s, 2030s, is now you're going to see disruption at the regional level, at the Alberta level. And you're going to see the industry, and then you're going to see maybe some of the oil companies in trouble. Now, interesting thing about Alberta, they've been struggling with this for a while. I did a story back in 2018 where a lot of the junior companies, they used to have 700 at one time. They were down to like 186. And since that time to now, all the juniors are almost gone. There's not very many of them left. And even some of the intermediates have failed. There's been a consolidation in the industry because of the events of, in the early year or two of the pandemic, prices fell and there were tough years. And so the industry consolidated as a way to survive. Okay. But beyond that kind of disruption, we're going to see further disruption so that we begin to see softness in the Alberta industry. And then once you see that, there will be knock-on effects. Now, the UCP government of Danielle Smith currently has, I think they're forecasting a $5 or $6 billion budget deficit, but they've budgeted for $68 a barrel oil, and that oil is now, I think, under $60. So their deficit might even be much bigger unless we see a recovery fairly soon. We'll have to wait and see what happens. But one of the knock-on effects is that as prices fall, because demand is falling, is government revenues are affected. That means public services in Alberta will be affected. That means that employment will be affected. There's already been 20, 30, 40,000 jobs been lost in the oil patch in Alberta. More jobs will be lost. That'll affect smaller communities. That'll affect the business community. So on and on. The knock-on effects ripple through the economy as we see that industry softening. So my point here is not that this is absolutely going to happen, because there's many a slip betwixt cup and lip, as the old saying goes, and we could see the process I'm talking about. I think it's going to happen. I think the evidence and the data point to it happening. What if it happens in mid 2030s, late 2030s? Could happen. I mean, no one has a crystal ball. Could happen then. But what happens if what if it happens the way I've drawn it up here on this graphic? And that is a very powerful counter argument to Smith and Manning and to the oil industry, because by the time we get around to building a pipeline or two or three, whatever's required, and we put in some more LNG plants, by the time all of that gets planned, reviewed, and consulted and all the things that have to go into it, and then we have to build it, which doesn't take overnight. We'll be putting those assets, that infrastructure into place just as structural oil demand begins to decline after peak oil demand in 2030. What happens then? Well, one thing I can tell you, and this is why all Canadians need to pay attention, is that there will be Canadian taxpayers' money, and lots of it, that will go into those assets if, in fact, they're built. Because take a pipeline. No private company, they said they're not interested in building oil pipeline. No, thank you, ma'am. I'm not doing it. And so if the government decides that it does want to do it, it either has to do it itself, like it did with Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, which cost the government $34 billion to build. I mean, $34 billion. Imagine doing 2 or 3 of those or more. So there are big dollars here, and I want to advance the argument that there is enough risk of my scenario that I've drawn out here coming true, that policymakers and decision makers should seriously consider if, in fact, those are good investments. Now, maybe there are smart economists who've been working on this. I haven't seen it, but maybe they are, and they've done the demand scenarios and the price scenarios, and they know where Alberta can sell its ultra heavy sour crude, and we know how much everything is going to cost. But everything in the public realm has just been rhetoric. Give us pipelines. There's lots of demand. Give us pipelines. We'll sell the oil to Europe. We'll sell the oil to Asia. Our LNG will displace coal in Asia. Well, what if it doesn't? What if there's no demand? I mean, nobody's asking these questions. Energy Media might be the only one in Canada asking those questions. It's certainly not commonly asked. Let's put it that way. So my point here, to wrap up my argument, is that Preston Manning and Danielle Smith are essentially the mouthpieces for the oil industry centered in Alberta. And when they say, if we don't get what we want, we're going to initiate a national unity crisis. We're going to look at Alberta and Saskatchewan. Preston Manning says the West, but BC is not crazy about independence. So let's say Alberta and Saskatchewan. We're going to take our ball and go home, and we're going to leave Canada. They are essentially saying, if you don't give the oil industry what it wants, we're going to leave. Coyne was absolutely right. Andrew Coyne, when he gave a very pointed criticism for a national columnist, he called out Preston Manning on this, and he's absolutely right. It's no way to run a country. You don't always get what you want. You have to compromise, and they are not prepared to compromise. And they need to be held to account by Albertans. They need to be held to account by Canadians, because what they want is very risky. And are we willing to risk the breakup of the country over a risky investment? I think we should not.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.